Hello and welcome to a brief introduction to primary and secondary sources in classical studies. I'm Jenny Dale. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm your classical studies librarian. If you need any help finding or accessing the kind of sources I talk about in this video, please let me know. My email address is jedale2@uncg.edu. At the end of this video, I hope you feel comfortable defining primary sources in the context of the humanities generally and classical studies specifically. I also hope you feel comfortable defining secondary sources in the context of the humanities generally, which will apply to classical studies. Let's start with primary sources. Generally, primary sources are original sources of information that haven't been filtered through analysis or examination. What constitutes a primary source is different depending on what discipline you're in, and even within the same discipline can vary based on how you're using the source. In the humanities, we're usually looking for one or both of the following characteristics for a primary source. One, historical authenticity. So these are our first-hand accounts that were created during the time period that we're studying. The other is originality, which applies to things like physical artifacts as well as works of art and literature. In classical studies, we're often looking for both. So our primary sources, whether they're historical accounts or original works, are typically going to be from the time period we're studying as well as the geographical area that we're studying. One exception is translation. So translations from original languages like Greek or Latin are typically going to be acceptable as primary sources, even if they were translated many years after the fact. Examples of primary sources in classical studies include personal accounts, literature like poetry and plays, essays, speeches, philosophical texts, works of art, physical artifacts, and more. A few examples here on this slide are a marble plaque, a collection of ancient Roman bottles that were probably used in medicine, and then a marble funerary statue set of a maiden and a little girl. The second category we're going to discuss today are secondary sources. So in the humanities, secondary sources typically analyze those historical events or original works that we think of as primary sources. Often a secondary source is going to engage with specific primary sources through analysis, examination, or interpretation. An important thing to keep in mind is that typically a secondary source is going to be removed in some way historically from the time period that's being studied. Common secondary source formats in the humanities include scholarly books. So for example, we have a monograph here, which is the term we use when we have a book on a single subject. It's often written by a single author, but it can be written by more than one. In this case, Christina Milner is our author. And if we scroll through here, this entire book was written by Christina Milner. Each chapter is written by her. We don't see any indication of other contributors. And so this is probably the kind of text that's meant to be read as a single narrative. Another example of a common secondary source format in the humanities is a scholarly book chapter. So here's an example where we actually have something that looks fairly similar in terms of the way it's set up, but we have two editors in this case, Jacqueline Faber-Saris and Allison Keith. And these editors have put together this book where each chapter is written by a different person. So it's essentially a collection of standalone book chapter sources, which means that it's not necessarily meant to be read in a single sort of linear narrative and can be a situation where, for example, I may only need this one chapter, and that would stand alone for me as a scholarly book chapter source. Finally, an example that you may be familiar with, peer-reviewed journal articles. So here's an article called Women Writing in Medicine in the Classical World by Rebecca Fleming, which was published in the peer-reviewed journal Classical Quarterly back in 2007. And this is a scholarly journal article, a peer-reviewed article that I found using JSTOR. So those are just a few examples of the primary formats that we see when we're talking about secondary sources in the humanities. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you have any questions or need any help, please contact me or use the Chat with a Librarian feature on the library homepage. Thanks so much.